Hello and welcome. I'm Tony Vlahos for ExecuNet. I'm going to begin my brief intro as people continue to stream into the virtual room. Joining me are two people I cannot say enough kind things about, Harriet Lowenthal and Stuart Levine. Both are ExecuNet career advisors and strategists with a tremendous amount of experience working with executives at the senior levels, people who want the very best help throughout their job search and ultimately to emerge as the best possible candidate. Today, Harriet and Stu will be taking your questions around the interview, how to turn that important meeting into an offer. All that's just ahead, but first, just a couple of quick housekeeping things and we'll kick it off. Today's session will run around 30 minutes, possibly a little longer because we have a little introductory PowerPoint presentation from Harriet and Stu, which is really awesome. So we'll have the Q&A. If you have a question, use the chat box to ask it, rather the question box. If you're having any technical challenges, chat to us, and my amazing colleague Kim behind the scenes will help you out as always. And before you leave today, please take a moment to complete our little evaluation form. It would mean a lot to us. So I'm going to jump right into it and turn it over to Harriet and Stu. Stu is not on camera, but he can hear what I have to say, and you'll have certainly an opportunity to chat in your questions and he'll be able to reply. You'll hear him. So with that, Harriet, please take it over.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today. Stu and I are really excited. If we could have the next slide, please, Kimberly. Thank you. So we are asked a number of questions all the time as strategists and coaches, and one of those is, a real focus on preparing one's resume and or LinkedIn profile. And while that's certainly important, we know that the primary job of both of those is to get you noticed and get you in the door. So we're purposely starting beyond that. What happens when the conversations begin or interviews? And we both were drawn to this quote from a former head of Heidrick and Struggles. You can't tell by looking at a piece of paper what some of the strengths and weaknesses really are. And that's it. And a lot of people come prepared to talk only about what's on their resume. But in reality, the interviewers want to know more. Stuart, anything to add here?
No, not really. I assume most of you know out there that generally speaking, hiring managers look at an interview for 6 to 10 seconds, maybe. So they get an overview, it's the sizzle, but I've never seen a piece of paper hire anyone. It is going to be how you relate, tell your story, describe your value to the company during an interview that's going to make the difference.
Exactly. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of quotes here, and I won't read them to you, but sort of broadening from business lessons from executive search individuals, and many of you will recognize Russell Reynolds. That's one of the individuals that wrote a book a while back. And there's 2 points here that we really thought are very important. So here's your first 2 bits of advice. Number 1 is to have a good story, an opening, a commercial that really summarizes not only what you bring to the table, but also begins to lay the foundation to talk about who you are. If I put on my executive assessment hat from the many days I spent doing that work, many years actually, we used to talk about a 3-legged stool to really understand and support executive success. And that would be what you know. So think about your formal and informal knowledge base, your education, what you've gained from experience, and so on. What you've done, which obviously would be the various jobs that you've held and the accomplishments, many of which are captured on your resume. And then finally, who you are. It's your why. What's behind all of that you bring to the table that really creates that unique value that Stuart mentioned? The next, and let me stop before I go on to the next point. Stuart, anything around
So, yeah,
values?
I mean, what I would add to this is, and maybe we were scheduled to talk about this in a minute. I don't know, but I think this is a good time. Is these quotes and what Harriet just said is really about the tell me about yourself question. I mean, it starts right off the bat. I mean, when you really get down to it, regardless of how the question's asked, the question is, why should I hire you? And what I have found is that many people answer the tell me about yourself question, not with a story, but by going through information the interviewers already have. They start at the bottom of their resume and they work up to the top. You're lucky if there's a few interviewers, if they're all still listening, but it's probably unlikely that they really are. This is a great opportunity to show you the research, that you know what they're looking for, and to put this story together, that if they're looking for a salesperson, then you're going to start talking about your sales experience. And you're going to have a story that they're going to be able to relate to. And you're also going to give some sense of who you are, some sense of personality. Because at the end of the day, they're looking for a fit, and they're looking for someone who can do what they're looking for.
And if you back away and think about the research of what makes executives successful and what makes them derail, it really is about who they are. I'm echoing here. Um, so that's the other piece of that. The other point really gets into preparation, and Stuart started speaking to preparing your stories. We often will use the STAR model or the behavior interviewing model to talk about and organize your stories. So if you think about STAR standing for situation or task, action, and result, those bring to life the complete information. Oftentimes on your resume, we focus on result. We have very little about the situation or the action component, and that's what needs to be added. That next quote, though, really talks about preparing where things haven't gone well. How often is it that someone you've been interviewing, when you say, can you contrast that with a situation that may not have turned out as well, and they suddenly are caught off guard and may say, I can't think of anything? That's what we want to avoid. So when you prepare your stories, also think about those situations that haven't turned out well, what you've learned from them, and perhaps what you did differently the next time. Let's have the next slide. And Stuart, I think you can pick up from there because it kind of goes together.
Well, I really, just want to also focus on something Harriet just said, because she mentioned behavioral interviewing, and she also mentioned the STAR method. And what I've learned over the years is to not assume that everyone in the audience knows what we mean when we say STAR method or behavioral interviewing. Which basically is a concept that says the way you've treated something in the past is the way you're going to deal with it in the future. Or, following up on what Harriet said, what you're going to learn from it so that it will change how you deal with it in the future. So my advice to everyone out there is, if you do not know what the STAR method is, STAR, situation, task, action, result, and how to answer a question using that formula, or you're just unfamiliar with what behavioral interviewing is, get professional help, read a book, do whatever it is you need to do, because if you don't know what that means, you are going to be lost, and you're not even going to know why, if you're interviewing with organizations that do that. And this quote, answer the question that's implied, not necessarily one that's asked, goes right back to what Harriet started with, and I say it a little differently, is every question is, why should we hire you? And you look at it that way, and if you've done your research, if you know what they're looking for, you want to answer your questions in a way that's answering their need. That's just what you want to do.
Stu,
Yeah, most. Go ahead.
sorry to interrupt, but I'm getting a chat from people who'd love to know. Would you please repeat what STAR stands for since you're talking about it?
Okay. STAR. Think STAR. S, situation. T, task. A, action. R, result. When you answer a question, one of the biggest complaints interviewers have is that the candidate speaks too much. That's a major complaint. If you have a formula for how to answer a question, everything starts with a situation or task. It's one or the other. Then there's an action, and then there's a result. And something that interviewers, of course, want to know. They want to know you're a team player. They want to know you're collaborative. They want to know all of that. But more than that, they want to know the action you took. So again, if you think about it, everything was either, well, I walked into this situation or I was given this assignment. Situation, task, action taken, result gotten. And it's such a nice, concise way to tell the story. And it's extremely effective.
And I would just add, when we talked about preparing those examples for things that have not worked out well, you can still use the STAR model. The difference is the A, the action component, might be actions you took that perhaps you should not have taken, or it can be inaction, something that you did not do that perhaps you should have done. And then, of course, the result is the result. But in that case, it's something that may have been missed. So it's very applicable both to positive examples or things where you achieved the outcome, and for those stories where you did not. Okay, the next one, please. Next slide. So I love this because it sort of summarizes not only what they're looking at in you, but also what you're looking at as a candidate about the company and about the individuals. Can you do the job? Will you love the job? Can we tolerate working with you? So if you think about your strengths, the value that you bring to the table, do you have the motivation to not only do that job, but also work within that company? And finally, can you fit within that organization, and can you tolerate working with those that you meet and that you would be reporting to? Stuart?
Well, I agree with you. To me, again, it's always, why should we hire you? And I think that those three questions say it.
Exactly. And then one last slide, and we'll open it up to hopefully more questions, unless there's some that you're seeing, Tony, that we need to address.
Let's get through it, and there are lots of questions.
Okay,
We'll save
this
them
is
as soon
the
as you're done. Thanks.
last one, actually. And that is, it goes back to preparation. So we've been focusing on, and maybe this should have been the first slide now that I think about it. We've been focusing on, what are you going to say? What are you going to present? What are your stories? But even before you do that and begin to organize that, there's one really important component, and that is your due diligence on the organization and the people that are going to be interviewing you. So our advice is, go beyond what you are provided by the recruiter or the organization. Spend some time not only on their website, but do a broader internet search. What can you learn about the company, the products, the customers, and the people that are going to be interviewing you? And one tip I will often give those that I'm coaching is, for public companies, the investor relations part of the website is a wonderful place to go for press releases, videotapes, end of year, annual reports, those kinds of things. And there's a wealth of information within each of those items. Stuart?
Yeah. One of the interesting things that I hear on a regular basis from executives all of whom are, and I'm sure all of you are very accomplished, is if I can only get the interview, if I can only get the interview, I always do well. Except that's not true. Except we all believe that. But some of us have a harder time than we should getting past the initial screen. Some of us can get past the initial screen, but have a hard time getting past the second interview. And the thing is, interviewing is something you practice and you study and you get better at. I just feel, and the things we're talking about really make a difference. Doing your research, knowing your themes, having your stories ready to go. And one other thing, and then I'll be done, is a lot of people study their answers to questions. I understand that, but I think it's more important to know how to answer a question than memorize what you think might be the question. And so this behavioral interviewing, the STAR method, it's really very important to do and consider the things that we've been discussing today.
And the last slide, Kimberly, which simply says thank you. And just, I think if we could recap, what we do is we help experienced executives to become great candidates. And some of the advice that we've been giving today gives you a little bit of a glimpse into what we do as we prepare individuals one-on-one as well. So Tony, we'll turn it back to you.
Yes, thank you. And before we get to the marvelous questions, I just want to draw your attention, everyone, to what Kim chatted earlier. These are broad strokes today. Your questions are going to get awfully specific. We're going to cut to those. But if you certainly want to close the deal at your next interview, by all means, follow the link that Kim chatted. It will give you access to one-on-one expert help from one of our career strategists. Could be Stu, for example. So this is a 1-hour session. It's free of charge. If you're interested, follow the link and let's get on with the questions. So first one, Harry, I'm going to turn to you. We know the role of the resume is, of course, to get us to the interview. And we know that recruiters and hiring managers are often, probably during that process, checking out our LinkedIn profile as well. What is the role, if any, of those documents when I'm at the interview? And if they don't have a place at the interview, what could I bring to the interview to help me make my case?
Well, obviously, they're going to have your resume at the interview, and you can assume that they're going to formulate many of their questions based upon what's on your resume. So we don't want to discount the fact that the resume is very important. And that's really going to be part of your job, is to bring your resume to life. In terms of bringing something to the interview, we often recommend a document that is different, that's exciting, and presents your value in a very different way. We call it a value graphic, which is a combination of a summary of your career, a few of the highlights about the value that you offer, and then some kind of interesting graphic to include additional information, such as competencies, oftentimes a global map for those who have that sort of experience.
Okay, terrific. We talked a little bit earlier about the importance of due diligence. Stu, I'm going to turn to you. What's the best way to, in fact, research the company I'm interviewing with?
Well, I mean, we live in a world with the internet, which is really a wonderful thing. If it's an invention you're all not aware of, you probably should become aware of it fairly soon. But we have company websites which have wonderful information, investor relations information, which Harriet talked about. You can learn a lot by looking at the job postings, other job postings that the organization has put up, that gives you some sense of the type of person that they're looking for, what's important to them. You certainly want to do some research. Again, it's probably on the website about the executives, where they came from. Because anytime you can indicate during the interview the research you've done, where you can figure out a way you're connected in the past, it's a positive. The culture. You want to know the clients. You want to know their products. You want to know their services. You want to speak to current employees. You want to speak to former employees that you know. And if you're wondering where LinkedIn fits in, well, you can make a lot of connections and find out who you know that worked there. And of course, also part of the interviewing research is to get some sense of who the interviewers are and what the process is going to be,
Mhm.
which the person who's setting this up for you should be very willing to share that with you. I mean, bottom line is the more I know, the better I feel prepared, the more confident I become.
Okay, awesome. Harriet, let's turn back to you. We've all been in situations where there's a phone interview, and then there's a panel or group interview, and then finally there's the interview interview. Tell us about each of these junctures, and is there something uniquely different about each of these as we move toward ideally a coveted offer? How should we handle each of these?
Well, there are slightly different strategies involved. Usually, if I put my selection system hat on for a moment, the screening interview is designed to screen candidates into the process who are qualified, meet the minimal qualifications of what we're looking for. Now, some of that has already occurred when they look at your resume and or LinkedIn profile. So they're looking to confirm that you can do what you say you can do and to begin that sense of knowing you and meeting you. So authenticity, keeping your answers very short, and realizing that you're probably not going to go into any depth or detail during the screening process. The next set of interviews then oftentimes are done by phone. Again, if I'm coaching someone on setting up a selection system, we talk about putting the least expensive processes first. So that means it's probably going to be a phone interview or sometimes a webcam interview of some sort using one of the services like Skype. Although in today's world, and to Stuart's point of technology, we've had individuals who are asked to record their answers um, uh, using their camera onto a site, and those are being viewed by someone on the other side. So there's a lot of creativity that goes into it. It's not necessarily a voice-to-voice conversation anymore at that point. And then finally, when you are brought on site, it depends on the organization. Amazon is known for their group interviews. If they are organized, then different people as part of the panel have assignments of what they're going to question you about. Although the same can be said for those who are going to be interviewing you one-on-one. Let's say there's a series of 4 or 5 interviews one-on-one. Ideally, those people will be assigned certain things that they need to speak with you about. And it doesn't mean that you have to have, 20, 30, 40 different stories. You can still go back to those same stars, if you will, but you can go in depth depending upon who you're talking to. So, for example, if it's the CFO, you're going to really talk about how you manage the budget, as an example, or what you may have earned for that company. If it's the HR person, you might tell us that same story, but now you're going to focus on people, how you developed others, how you built your team, etc. So those are some of the nuances that we need to plan for once you know who your target audience, who the interviewers are going to be.
Okay, great. So let's bounce back to Stu, and we can hear from Harriet as well on this one. The dreaded question, which does come up at different points, about salary. How do I respond when I'm asked about salary requirements? Stu, let's start with you.
So this is a question that comes up all the time, and you very often hear, "Oh, never talk about salary. You shouldn't talk about salary." The reality is, as we all know on this call, that pretty much isn't possible in terms of never. It certainly makes sense that you don't, well, I'm not sure I believe what I'm about to say, so let me say it differently. It would be nice if the organization would simply tell you what the salary range is. That would be nice. But let's talk about some options if you don't want to be the first to say the salary. So they ask you what your salary is. My first question is, would you tell me what the salary range is? Keep in mind what Harriet said, especially in the phone screen. They're just trying to see if you might get screened out. But don't think they won't give you information if you ask. I mean, you will be surprised more than half the time. You just say, "Well, can you tell me what the range is?" And they'll tell you. You could say, give an answer that goes along the line of, I'm certain I would be happy, with what we would come up with if it seemed like we were in a good fit, or that type of answer. Now that I've said that, let's talk about actually giving an answer. If this is an online and you can't get by it and you have to give an answer, if you have to give a number, there is plenty of research out there that says after you've done your research, after you know what the range probably is, be reasonably aggressive. If you're going to put a number down that you're going to be happy to live with. Let them back off of that maybe, but don't start so low that you're never going to get where you want to be. If it's a range, give a range that clearly includes what you're willing to accept. So it all really begins to get back down to doing research. There are online resources. There are people that work there, and being willing to be who you are and say what you want if it gets to that. And then there's one other thing I want to mention. If you're working with a retained recruiter, and this recruiter asks you what your expectations are, tell him or her. A retained recruiter is not someone you mess around with. Maybe once you give it a shot, but they've got to know you trust them and they trust you. Harriet, what do you see differently from what I just said?
The only thing that I would add is to try and broaden the conversation when you can to speak to total compensation. We've been focusing on salary range and so on, but think about the tangibles and intangibles that are important to you. I was coaching a person yesterday around this very topic where he wants to be prepared. And he just left, took early retirement from his organization where he was making an incredible salary, had a lot of opportunity for bonuses and so on. But the cost of that personally was a lot of global travel and time away from his family. So he has decided that while his parents are still alive, he would like to have some flexibility and time to have with them. So, in essence, that's an intangible piece of what he's looking for. And he has to personally decide what are the trade offs am I willing to give in dollars and cents, if you will, in order to gain that valuable time. So, your time is important. Perhaps having a seat at the table for strategy or on the board is important. What about going to conferences, working in the community on behalf of the organization? All of those are part of that total executive compensation and should not be ignored. And
Okay.
they may compensate for some of those other things.
hmm This is a fully participatory call, so I would feel neglectful if I didn't share the creative comment of one of our listeners, and I'll read it verbatim. Let's not let a number get in the way of a good fit. I kind of like that. Whoever sent that in, thank you. I won't reveal your name, but I appreciate that a lot. Okay, so let's move on to some really nitty-gritty questions, things that we encounter in that interview, and there's some tough moments for us. I'll take the first one, which goes, I was fired by my last employer. How do I bridge this troubled water at the interview when I'm asked, so what happened at your last job? How do you handle that one? Harriet, let's start with you.
Well, not knowing the circumstances, that is a very difficult one to handle. You have to be reticent of the fact or reminded of the fact that if they check references, Ideally, the only thing that your former company is going to provide is would they rehire you, and they can confirm salary. Most organizations will not give out publicly the reasons for termination or those sorts of things unless they happen to know someone who knows someone and they end up speaking with a hiring manager or your manager directly. Um, you could talk about the circumstances of perhaps challenges in the business, a change in direction and strategy that was no longer a good fit, the fact that perhaps I was able to achieve what I was hired to do, whatever that might be, and I felt it was time to move to a different organization. But it's hard to give you more specifics without knowing all of the details. But that is certainly something that comes up in coaching all the time. And I've been known to call a company or two as a recruiter asking about a candidate to see what they say as part of our coaching as well.
Okay. Stu, let's please take this one. I took a break from work due to health issues. What's the best way to address this gap during the interview?
So, I mean, my answer to all of these types of questions is you want to be honest, but being honest doesn't mean you have to say every single element of your life. You want to be honest. Um, if it's a health issue and you feel comfortable saying it, I wouldn't get into what it was, but I would certainly emphasize that all is well. All is well today. I'm ready to get back to work. I am excited about it. Um, what's really also extremely important is what else were you doing? What certifications did you take during this period of time? You know, what I find, and Harriet, I'm really interested in how, your reaction to this, but I think most of us on this call know that your body language, your tone of voice, the confidence you exude is really more important than the actual words you speak much of the time. And you may have to think of how you want to tell the story, but if it's honest, it's straight to the point, you're not apologizing about it, and you're ready to make a contribution, most people go right by it. That's my experience. All right.
Yeah, I would agree, and I do think honesty is very important. The other is, you know, what have you done during that break? Stuart mentioned certifications. It is a great time to take a class, perhaps start a blog, do some research, those kinds of things. So there are ways of filling that in. But it's much easier, I think, to explain that gap than it is to have a gap simply because you haven't landed somewhere else. And even then, you really need to fill in that time with something meaningful.
Okay. Isn't there also an opportunity when, I'll use as another example that was chatted in, I took the time away to care for a family member. And for me, that's an illustration potentially of a situation where you prioritized, you did something that was far more meaningful. And telling that story and embracing it as the thing that was the right thing to do would work on me as an interviewer. What's your take on that?
Well,
Yeah, I
absolutely.
think, yeah, go ahead, Stuart.
No, I mean, that's absolutely, the first question, about, I was ill. That's very different than I'm taking care of my parents, which is the absolute right thing to do.
Right.
I think it gives a picture into who you are as a person, and it was something that you felt you should do, and I just think that's fine.
Okay. I've been at the same job for 20 years. This is a different kind of wrinkle. So sometimes that's perceived as a really great thing. You've got longevity. Sometimes it's perceived as, why haven't you moved around a bit more? So how would you recommend someone who's in that situation handle that question? Stu, let's stick with you, then we'll bounce over to Harriet.
Well, the fact you've been in one company does not mean you've only done one thing. Let's
Sure.
let's kind of start with that. So you really want to think about your career. You really want to think about the various positions you held, the various responsibilities you've had. And this is where the whole idea of the stories come in, where you can talk about what you've accomplished and the various challenges. But there's another part to this, to the question, and that is, um, you really can't predict how everybody you interview with is going to react to things. What you have control over is how you present yourself and how you look at your experience and how you believe you are qualified for this job. And that's just how you have to look at it. Confidence is extremely important. So, it's a strange world that we all live in, where longevity, where when I was young was a great thing, has now become, gosh, you stayed there for more than 18 months. What's your problem? The problem is I'm loyal to the company that I joined. And I don't see that as a problem.
Right.
All right.
I definitely agree. I'm laughing because I was thinking the exact same thing where we used to question job hoppers. Um, and certainly 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, they were still job hopping, but now that's the norm. I would totally agree with everything Stuart said. And the other thing that I would add is, again, going back to your resume, just looking at a title and what you've done can be very misleading. And so, talking about special projects or being called upon in certain situations because of your expertise, all of that becomes important. And if it's an organization, going back to fit, where they value loyalty and they value commitment and so forth, then you are presenting that as a positive.
Okay. So even more than the dreaded, so tell me about yourself question, many of us fear the question, what are your weaknesses? What's the best way to handle that question? Harriet, let's stick with you, then we'll bounce over to Stu.
So if I were training you as an interviewer, I would tell you that's a terrible question, because it's going to get you a hypothetical or theoretical answer or opinion, not really an example of what the person can do. That's one of those where even when you're asked that question, you can answer it quite creatively or whatever. So you might talk about an awareness that you had about yourself, and what you did about that. So, for example, I'm thinking of many years ago someone who didn't present himself well, and he would get very low ratings, if you will, or feedback on internal presentations that he did. People were afraid to approach this individual because they felt he wasn't personable. And so he began to work on things he could do differently. And if I were him, he could share. There was a time in my career where I was very uncomfortable presenting, very uncomfortable sometimes in speaking with people. And it's not because I didn't care, which was the perception. It's because I was shy. And so I really began working on things such as eye contact, such as practicing presentations and getting feedback. And I found that I got better as time went on. And so that's how I learned to compensate from that weakness. And it's something I still continue to work on every day. And I really appreciate those situations where people are willing to provide me with that insight if I slip back into that pattern.
Okay. Stu, anything to complement what Harriet said?
I would just give a few. So the key is a weakness that is not key to their need. So even in Harriet's example, if they're hiring you to be a professional trainer in front of thousands of people on webinars, for example, you don't want to talk about how you don't do very well in presentations. So you wanna come up with a weakness that is not going to hit right into what they're looking for. It's going to be something in the past, and you're going to be talking about how you improved on it. Exactly what Harriet said.
Okay.
Really,
Awesome.
question. That's such a wasted question and time, and you shouldn't be giving an answer that's bearing your soul. It's just like, come up with something, move on.
Okay, great. We talked about fit and how important it is, how critical it is to getting that offer. So certainly the interview is a two-way street, right? It's not just you getting asked questions, it's your opportunity to ask the right questions of the hiring manager. So what types of questions should I be asking? And the flip side is, what questions do I avoid asking? Let's start with you, Harriet.
Well, you need to know yourself first and foremost. You know, where will you do your best work? And there's different types of fit. So there's position fit, which is obvious. Is that the right position for you? Do you see yourself happy in doing what's being asked of you? Will it have those challenges and opportunities that motivate you? The other, of course, is organization fit, and we've talked about that. Can you see yourself working with those people? What about the values and of that organization? And then finally, if it's applicable, location fit. If you're uprooting yourself and or your family, does the location offer things that will help you to balance out your work life? So you're not just looking at what you'll be doing well at work, if you will, but also beyond that. In terms of questions, for example, for me, I really love thinking out loud. I'm an ENFP for those of you that know Myers Briggs. So I think out loud. I get energy from interactions with other people. And I would be curious around how decisions are made, how is information shared. Will I have that opportunity to contribute? Some organizations are, that's part of their culture. That's part of how they go about things. Others, they do things more independently without bringing in and consulting a lot of people. So that, for me, that team environment, how decisions get made, how information is exchanged, those kinds of things become important.
Okay.
That's one question. Stuart, you probably have others.
Well, I mean, I think a point is it's important to ask questions. If you're speaking to the hiring manager, it's okay to ask, can you, what's the management style? What's the culture like in the organization? What would be the expectations? Uh, you know, what would success in this position look like when we look back 6 months from now? I mean, you get insight into how the person you're going to be working with thinks. I think that's important. That's it.
Okay, great. We've all been in situations where we've said something and moments later wish we hadn't said it, at least not the way that we said it. The chat I'm getting is, I'm at an interview, it's a big deal, and I've said something and I wish I could take it back, but I can't. How do I backpedal from giving what I perceive to have been the wrong answer or say it in the wrong way? Is there any advice on how we can do that, Harriet?
Well, again, if an interviewer will ask something like, is there anything else we haven't talked about, or is there anything else you would like to add? That's an opportunity to say, to be honest, I was thinking back to the response that I provided when you asked X. And I'd like to just clarify that a bit more. When I said this, I hope it wasn't misleading or whatever it is, and then provide your correction. So I think we're back to honesty. The worst thing you can do is walk out of there and beat yourself up over it. You have an opportunity to speak up and say something. I mean, in my opinion, we're all adults in the room, and it's perfectly okay to do that. If it's not okay to do that and it becomes an issue or a barrier, then I know for me the question would be, is this someplace I'd want to work? I would start to question my fit within that organization. But if it's that important to you, I think correcting it is something that I would encourage you to do.
Okay. Stu, any additional thoughts?
Well, I wish, I'm just sitting here smiling, listening to Harriet. Um, Everything Harriet said, and just a little different point of view. I think this is a great opportunity to make it clear who you are. I mean, honestly, if it's me, I'm either going to wait to the end because I'm going to take a note and say when question time comes, there's no way I'm not going to do it. Or I'm just going to at some point say, you know what, I have an answer and I'd just like to try that over again because I really didn't, the words were coming out of my mouth, but it just wasn't me. And I mean, this is your opportunity. Don't leave and be beating yourself up for not doing something.
Hmm.
But the one other thing I just want to mention, and we'll move on, is it's rarely one answer. It's rarely one moment that makes a giant difference. We'll focus on it, but it's generally the overall performance. I'll use that word.
Hmm.
Not, I wished I answered that question 3 degrees differently.
Okay. We're going to take a couple of more. I know we've gone well past the half hour, but I think it's been well worth it. Thank you both very much. And to the hundreds who've stuck through this. So when we're at an interview, it's not just our mouths that are moving and speaking, but our bodies are speaking too. So talk to us a bit about body language. Are there certain positions, postures we should not assume? And also looking at the person across the desk, what do you make of that character when things start to seem really weird to you? How do you not get distracted or thrown off your game by an interviewer who doesn't seem that interested in you anymore, and yet you've got a lot to say? Harriet, let's start with you.
Well, we're back to interview prep again and knowing the company and, knowing how you should dress. I often will suggest as an example, if you're if you're interviewing for a tech company and there's a lot of young individuals there and you're not, the last thing you want to do is show up in a coat and tie, as an example. So, nor would you show up though in a t-shirt and jeans and, the latest whatever footwear you might have, but sort of split that middle. So there is a certain degree of alignment that you want to have with those that are interviewing you and prepare for that. And that's certainly a question you can ask of a recruiter or perhaps someone that works there if you're not sure. It's very difficult when you're picking up on nonverbal cues um, from the interviewer and you're not feeling comfortable. Um, Again, a skilled interviewer will find a way to end the interview early by saying something like, I think I have what I need, and in their minds they might, and end it there rather than making really you uncomfortable and themselves uncomfortable. Hopefully, you're not always planted across a desk. It's easier to connect with individuals if, one person's, let's say, on the side and one's on, in the middle of the other area. So that's a difficult thing. But trust your gut. Try not to let that distract you. Stay focused. Rely on your preparation. And that's really about all you can do in those awkward situations.
Hmm. Stu?
The only thing I would add to this, and I love this question, by the way, but the only thing I would add, and my point of view when I talk about interviews, is I think you get ready for the interview the night before. What you're going to wear it's all there. You're going to get in the car. You're going to arrive 10 minutes early. You're going to do things on purpose. You're going to know if you're going to sit or stand when you walk into the lobby. And I have to look at awards and all that kind of stuff. But there's just one part of your question that I would just like to mention. We are talking about body language, and that is pay attention if somebody is being not nice. I don't even know what to say except you don't want to work there probably. But pay attention to the body language that the person interviewing you is demonstrating. If they're leaning over the desk and you're leaning back like a mouse that you're shy, that's not a good thing. So pay attention to their body language because it's giving you a clue as to what they're going to be looking for in the candidate they're going to go for.
Okay, great.
I would suppose
Please.
you could ask, I just want to make sure, am I giving you the kind of information that you're needing? Might be a safe way to say, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you interested in me? But maybe not. I mean, maybe there's a question that they haven't asked you and they're feeling uncomfortable. And how do I interrupt you and ask something? So if it's that obvious to you, perhaps there's a subtle way of letting them know.
Good advice. Okay, we have come to not the half hour mark, but nearing the top of
Oh
the
wow.
hour mark. So, but that's a testament to how many questions our audience has, and I'm glad we were all able to stay and take almost all of them. I apologize. I know I didn't get to every single one. We do have to wrap this up. I want to give Harriet and Stu a few moments at the end to just share some parting thoughts before we officially wrap up. But once again, follow that link that Kim chatted. This is a golden opportunity to connect with one of our acclaimed strategists directly and ask some individual questions, things that maybe didn't occur to you during this call that now have or will later. You have that opportunity and you'll get so much more out of the direct interaction and move you further down the road to the position you want to get. So, Harriet, any final thoughts before we start to wrap up?
I would just summarize by saying, we've talked about preparation and the need for research and due diligence and your preparation, preparing your response to tell me about yourself. And of course, we talked extensively about the STAR model. We also talked a bit about what questions do you need to ask of those that are interviewing you so that you can make your decisions around fit and motivation. And there's a lot more I could say and look forward perhaps to the opportunity to speaking with some of you personally.
Okay, Stu, before we hear from you, Kim, please rechat that link. People missed it. So we'd love for them to see it. Stu, I'm sorry. Let us know your final thoughts.
My final thoughts really are that, a successful job search is about knowing who you are, um, focused on what you're looking for, know what your message is, be consistent with it in your resume, in your LinkedIn, and during your interview.
Mhm.
Don't change on them who you are. They brought you in. You talked about the importance of the resume and LinkedIn. They brought you in they met that first call because of the resume or LinkedIn, very likely. Consistent message, consistent in your resume on LinkedIn, consistent in your answers, and don't be afraid to show your personality because it's really important that they know who you are.
Really great point. Thank you. And thank you, Harriet, as well,
Thank
for
you.
sharing your insight. Thank you again, all, for your marvelous questions and most important, for your attention. And we look forward to connecting with you soon on this type of a session or a future masterclass. We'll be in touch. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day. Bye, all.